Kellerama, a Recorded Books Highbridge imprint, presents Citizen Trump, a one-man show, by Robert Orlando. Read by Charles Constant. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. C.G. Jung. The Filmmaker's Journey. A media virus seeks a host. One obvious media figure filled that role. Born to a family of great wealth, started as a businessman and ran for political office. He would use his profile in media to reach his audience. He spoke with great hyperbole. He would run for office as a result of feeling slighted by his political opponents. His campaign ran on a populist message of America first. He would be accused of having supported white nationalists and being engaged with dictators. In the end, he would lose his campaign. Yes, of course, it was William Randolph Hearst, and his life provided the subject for what would become the greatest film ever made, Citizen Kane. Robert Orlando. Donald Trump has dominated the media news cycle 24/7 for 4 years. Some days it feels like 40 years. At the time, you can look in any direction on any screen and see Trump. I had competed with his media omnipresence during the production and release of 2 of my earlier films, Silence Patton and The Divine Plan. Even so, development of a project about Trump has long been on my mind. But how to tell a story that has been told so many times and in so many ways? Oddly enough, I found my answer in the middle of a pandemic. When COVID-19 hit, it had me locked in my studio without work and worrying if I had the disease. To pass the time, I rewatched some of my favorite films, culminating with the American black-and-white classic Citizen Kane. In the context of 2020, and in the midst of the virus and a contentious election, I was struck by the similarities between the film's protagonist, Charles Foster Kane, and our own modern-day Citizen Trump. Then and there I found the way into my film, examined Trump through the lens of Kane. When I discovered that Citizen Kane was Trump's favorite film, I had my title. It was time to roll the camera. A character study. Though Trump was in the throes of campaigning for a second term, my aim was not to produce a political film. As an independent filmmaker, I was more interested in pursuing a deep character study into one of the most controversial figures of our time. My template was not a right versus left, faith versus non-faith, or even madness versus sanity paradigm, but to explore the archetypes of storytelling as expressions of interior character, especially where Trump and Kane were so amazingly similar. Like most New Yorkers, my perception of Trump had been that of a gossip column showman seeking media attention. To some degree, I just accepted him as is, the man who built Trump Tower, his latest affair, his special TV appearances, you name it. He added a charm to the NY landscape as far back as Rona Barrett's show, where she asked him if he'd like to be the President of the United States, or later in his friendly repartee on David Letterman. You would read about him in the New York Post one day, or hear him on Howard Stern the next, but he was rarely seen as a threat. Many of us just assumed even his best real estate deals were partly shady, though I never bothered to dig into the details back then. Periodically, Trump would announce a run for president, usually as a publicity stunt to sell books, but he would bail out once his books were bestsellers. Of course, he made good on one of those runs, and it was then, several years into his presidency, that my idea for Citizen Trump took shape. COVID-19 had created a somber mood in which to conjure my vision. What if, at the center of a deadly global pandemic, it fell to a fast-talking showman to lead America out of danger? Pre-COVID, as the stock market boomed, many people overlooked Trump's excesses, content to ride the prosperity wave. But as the disease ran rampant, it put the performer on the defensive. The urgent questions became, did Trump have the ability to switch roles and play the transparent leader, to be knowledgeable, direct, and reassuring? How would he deal with a crisis that not only could destroy the lives of hundreds of thousands, but also wipe out his presidency? Producer-director Orson Welles asked a similar question when exploring the formidable William Randolph Hearst, the model for his main character in Citizen Kane. Like Trump, Kane was a man of acquisitions, a media tycoon who ran for office, then suffered a great fall. Would Citizen Trump suffer the same fate? Could the parallels in their lives predict the outcome for Trump? My fascination with Kane began in film school when I first felt the power of sound, light, and action in the hands of a master. Welles, to me, was a titan, all four faces of cinema's Mount Rushmore: actor, producer, writer, and director. He was also a theater and radio star. Coincidentally, my studio was located across from Princeton University and the next town over from Hopewell, New Jersey, where Welles located his legendary War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938. That broadcast was an unforgettable moment in radio history. Welles's voice transfixed his audience, convincing many that the world was experiencing an alien attack. With war already spreading across Europe, invasion was on the public's mind, much as the news about the invasion and spread of COVID has been on our collective minds. As we sheltered in place, streets emptied, and stores and restaurants closed, I remained in a quiet old brick building. That's when I switched on the old movies to shut out the medical news, the election, and Trump. Or at least tried to. I found that blocking out the relentless media noise was key to opening a whole new perspective. For a short while, COVID allowed us to return to a simpler time. Refreshing, really, because the way we engage our world has left us precious little opportunity to be still, to quietly process ideas, to think. We're assaulted by non-stop data through our phones, cable news, memes, Twitter, Facebook, and an onslaught of social media platforms. And since 2016, the war between the media and Trump has been a daily dose of vitriol. It has been the grand narrative of our times and an unavoidable topic if one wants to remain relevant. In my self-imposed COVID prison, I concluded it was time for me to make a statement about the man and the times, and Citizen Kane would be my vehicle. My pick for best film of all time goes to Citizen Kane, a seamless visual masterpiece and a technical inspiration. In this one film, Welles introduced myriad innovations, breaking form and storytelling in new ways. It was incomparable at the time, almost docudrama in style. His pre-Hollywood background fed his achievement. He had an ear for radio and knew that the simplest sounds, a clock ticking, a distant dog barking, the wind, can transform a sequence. From his years in theater, he understood the effectiveness of proper stage blocking. In Kane, the camera moves through the noir-esque world as an objective bystander, the actors stepping in and out of the frame. Orson Welles, the man, provided me with further inspiration. His life bore an uncanny resemblance to the character Kane. The film is a work of genius and also a cautionary tale. I hold mixed thoughts about Welles and the Kane phenomenon. On one hand, he was the mercurial boy wonder with the largest train set ever in Hollywood, but his early fame, achieved in part by poking at Hearst, and a lack of discipline almost ended his creative and personal life. Only this once was Welles able to exercise his talents without restraint. Welles often said he started at the top and worked his way down. For most of his career, he could not make a living in Tinseltown. As I say in my film, and without judgment, there is a lot of Kane in Orson Welles. Likewise, there is probably some of Trump in me. Could there be another lens through which we can view and therefore explain and find meaning in the rise of Trump? Something beyond him that he may be unaware of or only partly aware of. Trump as anti-hero. Trump, like Kane, is an anti-hero in that his blind spots and flaws are self-wounding. However, in spite of his flaws, Trump surpassed Kane's failed run for governor to become President of the United States. As I thought more about the film and about Trump himself, it became clear that Trump emerged as a consequence of the Obama presidency, an administration that dismissed traditional Americans, reducing them to crazy religious gun owners. In this conflict, Obama was the antagonist, with a posse that included Hillary Clinton and the media. Media in general, but CNN and MSNBC in particular, was berating Trump. Fox was his champion, and for 4 years that was our ongoing reality TV. And what of Trump? The reality star as president had not helped himself by using daily briefings for self-promotion or taking frequent trips to Mar-a-Lago, which is reminiscent of Kane's own private fortress, Xanadu. As I pondered the similarities, it occurred to me that, whether it's Trump or the fictional Kane, the media's white noise is the same. In the old days, not so long ago, one might step into a darkened theater to escape that small-screen noise for an intimate story. My dark studio became my theater, only to find myself watching the same story I had seen on the small screen on the big screen. The parallels of Kane and Trump had been remarked on, but suddenly they were clear to me. Kane, with all his power and self-aggrandizement, forgot something essential and sacred. He forgot the necessity for genuine human connection. This ultimately left him alone, sad, and tragic. Too late, Kane would recognize that he had let slip through his fingers his rosebud moment. In the case of Trump, after his loss in the 2020 election, he too would isolate himself in the White House, except for a few loyalists. Though we have not seen the end of the movie, and can only speculate what might be his rosebud moment. We all have them. Those places and moments when we look back at the unresolved bits of our own past. Without the gaze backward, there is no looking forward. Could Kane's too-late discovery offer a roadmap to the next chapter in the Trump narrative? So, as I considered the elements of this project, there was me as the storyteller, the subjects Kane and Trump, the ghost of Welles, and then, of course, the audience. It's the audience that is my real concern. I was determined to look past the projected images of Trump as defined by the politicians and the news, and, like an old-time filmmaker, peer into the faces of the viewers and readers. After all, we all need a respite, like an old matinee in the middle of a workday, for those old enough to recall them. Outside the theater, real life goes on. Whether in the aftermath of the latest election or the next one in 4 years, the course our country is on is not predetermined. One person's performance in media should not be the criteria for our choice of leaders. Reality TV is as much about us as it is about the performers. Kane kept resonating in my head as I considered my main character. The stage is the thing. So, as Trump took center stage in my film, I set out to discover the motivations and seeming success of his pre-presidential career. How did this unlikely candidate capture the imagination of voters who hailed his arrival? Many believe that a radical voice had been reshaping and even erasing our traditions and historic legacy. Call it political correctness or culture warfare, nearly half of the population was left feeling desperate for a leader who could halt the progressive agenda, a gunslinger and take-no-prisoners trailblazer. Enter Donald Trump, a self-sufficient, self-described billionaire with a successful reality TV show and big personality. He was a practiced showman, equipped to match the effect of 24/7 media, a slate of other Republican candidates, and the Democratic machine, and not just survive, but win. Most voters knew Trump was morally flawed, but didn't really care. By 2016, their stake in a national identity was worth more than the requirement that Trump wear a white hat. To his base, Trump was and remains the antidote, or chemotherapy, to a media that has overstepped its role. He was a levee against a tide of change. People felt Trump might have been the only figure standing between the America they knew and the America to be erased. Like Kane, he became, at least in public, the champion of the forgotten people. Welles wanted to call out Kane, Hearst, and his obsession with acquisitions that were much more numerous and grandiose than even Trump's, a drive that places material gain and human excess above the human bonds of virtue. On some level, Welles was speaking to himself, as I am likely writing to myself about Trump. There was a part of himself that Welles did not want to lose completely, a part that was damaged from having been abandoned, working as a child star and acting as caretaker to his alcoholic father. And we have come to learn that Trump's childhood was far from ideal. My identification with Trump is likely in his ambition, as one who sees the value of being in the spotlight, of needing a stage. After all, you can't share a good story if no one is listening. You can't make a high production value show without a big budget. And being a blind believer in yourself, if not to a fault, doesn't hurt. Trump was from Queens. I was from Brooklyn, and had moved into Manhattan before making my own journey out to Hollywood. And for all the ambition and drive and glitz, there is a dark side, or as Carl Jung would call it, a shadow side. In Citizen Trump, we don't know how these inner demons will play out after one term as president, but we know there is a shadow side to all success, a loss and gain, a rosebud. Citizen Kane is all too human a story. It is about the rise and fall of the powerful, the archetype of the father figure or moral king, and it is rare when they do not fall. They fall not because they are in a political struggle, but because they lose awareness of their own corruptibility. It's the same for Trump, but added to his archetype is the leader as trickster or shapeshifter, one who can hold an audience without restriction. I wanted to capture that in this book, not only for those in my age group, but with millennials in mind, those who do not have the length of life to see the patterns of those who come and go, rise and fall. What I want to tell them is to be like Welles, bold and independent-minded. Forget the herd and find your own voice. And for God's sake, watch the great films, the stories that tell us so much about ourselves and the hero's journey. Thank God for movies. 1. Roll camera. Rosebud. Kane. For decades, film critics have lauded Citizen Kane as one of the most important films in American cinema. Orson Welles wrote, directed, and starred in the 1941 classic. Although Welles claimed his protagonist, Charles Foster Kane, was an amalgam of characters, most knew his target was William Randolph Hearst. My own fascination with Donald Trump mirrors that of Welles. I continue to find the similarities between Trump and Kane uncanny. Here, for example, is an observation about the fictional Kane that could easily describe Trump. His acquaintances credit him with personal charm, but do not deny his ruthlessness in business operations. Shopkeepers and his nearest rivals are simply not in his class. He is success on a dizzying and truly American scale. Welles, as a world-class showman himself, knew he had to make the film relevant, as he had with his onstage Black Macbeth in Harlem and his radio stunt War of the Worlds. The New York Tribune columnist Dorothy Thompson acclaimed the broadcast one of the most fascinating and important events of all time. He made the scare to end all scares, the menace to end all menaces. It was a seismic theatrical event and a sign to come of the power of media. So when Welles hit Hollywood as a first-time film director, he understood that he had to create buzz, which he did by rattling the cage of the powerful Hearst. What he couldn't have known was that nearly 80 years later, another formidable man, Donald Trump, would take his cues from Citizen Kane. Welles, through the skill of his storytelling, uncovered deep truths and exposed character. Welles understood films as the looking glass for how we understand ourselves. It is a curious fact that whenever Welles spoke of films that he admired, he cited the great neo-realists, Rossellini, De Sica, and so on, writes Simon Callow in Orson Welles' Volume 1, The Road to Xanadu. Callow adds, "Their warmth, richness, and sense of life lived transcended," he said, "any technical limitations." Welles opens the film with Kane whispering the most chilling and iconic word in Hollywood history, Rosebud. As the camera enters the shadows, the audience sees the main character take his final breath as he releases a snow globe that crashes to the floor. The singular word lures us into a private moment of tragedy. Trump, the American audience, and this filmmaker have for decades been spellbound. After digging deep into this project, I discovered that some news coverage and even biographers believe Trump might have based his own life and fortune on Kane. Sound a little far-fetched? Well, it would not be the first time someone was inspired by a film. At first, I was skeptical, but now? Well, maybe the best answer is to keep listening. Like Kane, Trump aspired to greatness. Both crafted public facades to mask private insecurities. Each made themselves larger than life, and each was empowered by early failures. In our story, however, we begin with a lesser-known Trump, a man initially driven to become a movie mogul. He wanted to be a star. He has said, "I was attracted to the glamour of the movies, and I admired guys like Sam Goldwyn, Darryl Zanuck, and most of all Louis B. Mayer, whom I considered great showmen. But in the end, I decided real estate was a much better business." When his Hollywood dreams failed, he tried on a new role as a New York real estate tycoon. As author of Audience of One, James Poniewozik states plainly, so no film school, Fordham University, transfer to Wharton. Back to New York, back to Dad's office. Once Hollywood was out, Trump carried the acting bug across career lines. Perhaps without the needed skills to play featured characters on the silver screen, Trump's better option was to play himself as a star. In this sense, the formula for his reality TV personality was always one in the making. Trump's hybrid of Hollywood, New York real estate, business, and eventually politics was rehearsed over 25 years. Kitty Couric, when interviewed for the book The Method to the Madness, stated, "If the city is a play, then he's a character in that city, a Damon Runyon-type guy. He was never really embraced by New York society or the big swinging you-know-whats of Wall Street. He never had the street cred that he was searching for or got the imprimatur of some of those more sophisticated social people, and it drove him crazy. He definitely knew how to write a tabloid story. He just had a natural ability to communicate in bold headlines. His persona was beginning to take shape." The Trump story. Trump realized early that stories needed a beginning, a middle, and an end. Conflict is also key. Whether told on the silver screen, reality TV, or the political stage, stories need a villain, a victim, and a hero. Robert McKee, in his well-known film industry work on screenwriting, states the principle of antagonism. A protagonist and his story can only be intellectually fascinating and emotionally compelling as the forces of antagonism make them. The hero and the villain do battle, usually competing for the same prize: fame, power, sex. In the case of Trump, the conflict would escalate to the level of warfare. As author Poniewozik puts it, Trump believed, like a born reality TV producer, that warfare and distrust were the most productive and entertaining modes of existence. Both Trump and Kane knew how to start a war. In the case of the anti-hero, the lines between the good and the bad, and occasionally the ugly, are not so obvious. Anti-heroes are not morally upstanding, but they can still look like good guys compared to an even worse villain. And herein lies the grand strategy, a triangulation of mortal combat with a villain, a victim, and a hero, a formulation as old as stories themselves. Whether in Greek tragedy or the modern Western or war film, anti-heroes have always been part of the repertoire. In Victor Davis Hanson's book, A Case for Trump, he explains that tragic heroes and anti-heroes are often unlikable. Sophocles' Oedipus in Oedipus Rex was rudely narcissistic. In the film Ombre, John Russell, Paul Newman, proved arrogant and off-putting. Achilles in Homer's Iliad is self-absorbed and pouts that his service is never rewarded. Does this sound familiar? Trump is the anti-hero brought up to date for reality TV. Early on, he took calculated steps to look the part. He rewrote his privileged but unglamorous beginnings. Like Kane, Trump adopted the persona of a self-made man. Never mind that both characters had been handed a substantial inheritance. In Trump's case, $15 million, which he invested, with some questionable behavior, in a Manhattan hotel. Next, Trump invested in the creation of great enemies. As he stepped into the role of political anti-hero, Trump squared off against what he had defined as the enemies of America, the evil media, the swampy establishment, and China. But he was not paving new ground. He was reading the media and extracting what he needed from some influential fictional characters in addition to Kane. As Poniewozik reminds us, his psyche was formed by television. The exploits of ruthless, charismatic men, with few exceptions it was largely men, occupied The Sopranos, Deadwood, and Breaking Bad. Later, in Trump's presidency, Steve Bannon would say to the New York Times, "Dude, he's Archie Bunker." He meant it as a compliment. With the ground softened by TV anti-heroes, he could begin his land attack and fashion himself into the champion and protector of Middle America. Wielding his signature catchphrase, "Make America Great Again," MAGA, Trump transformed from tabloid curiosity to presidential candidate. As Poniewozik points out, the MAGA slogan was neither rosy optimism nor gloom and doom decline. Instead, it came off to half the country as can-doism. Trump leveraged his anti-hero persona on social media, cable news, and television to launch himself into the White House. And yet, it is at the peak of accomplishment, as it was with Kane, that cracks begin to show, and where a character's destiny is once again proved. With Trump in the Oval Office, Americans discover what it is like to live inside a reality TV show programmed for conflict, entertainment, and self-adulation. It is a phenomenon that the modern audience might find new and exciting, but in truth is ancient. Hansen writes that the 5th century BC comic dramatist Aristophanes, in right-wing populist fashion, had ridiculed Athenian gentry and its subsidized followers. Given the similarities of past with present, is it any surprise that some of our classic movie characters like Citizen Kane would emerge in our Citizen Trump? Let's journey to explore, and possibly even understand, the 45th president. What do Kane and Trump have in common? Why would one win and the other lose in their attempts at high office? How did Trump, a failed businessman with an unceasing desire for media attention and no political experience, prepare to play the role of a lifetime? The role of presidency. Studying a U.S. president through the lens of film and television might seem a trivializing exercise. Yet, when asked how his acting career served him in the role of president, Ronald Reagan responded that he didn't know how he could have been president without that training. John Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon in a televised debate largely because his opponent refused to wear makeup. Even Franklin Roosevelt, in conversation with Orson Welles, recognized the magic of film, suggesting they were the two greatest actors in the world. Our ears and eyes and noses process the symbolic behavior of those who stand in front of the throngs, and we still believe they know something we do not. They might. In any case, they are playing their roles for us, and that much they know with metaphysical certitude. Film and television help us explore and understand the archetypes of personality, what Swiss psychologist Carl Jung would describe as persona. Through film, we recognize stereotypes like the bully or the damsel in distress, the trickster or the outlaw. Trump reveals his admiration for Jung's theories on persona in his book How to Get Rich. Masks are our persona, and they provide a way to perform in the world. We have a public mask and a private mask. Yet Trump was quick to recognize that a man can lose himself behind the mask if he's not careful. He cautioned, just don't become your persona. Too much persona can release what Jung described as the shadow or the dark side of personality, the pure impulse toward power, fame, and pleasure without concern for consequence. In Citizen Kane, audiences are witness to the shadow as it slowly haunts, then overtakes the fallen man. Could this masterpiece, which plumbs the psychological depths and motivations of a fictional media tycoon, help explain the motives, aspirations, and insecurities of America's president? As with the fictional Kane, many of Trump's early attempts at grandeur came up short. He engaged in a series of shady real estate deals and a few symbolic wins like rescuing the Central Park skating rink. Trump made his name at the famed Kit Kat Club, buying drinks for models and exaggerating his net worth, an ongoing pattern. Investigative journalist and author David K. Johnston writes, in 1990, when his business empire was on the verge of collapse, Trump told me and many other journalists that he was worth $3 billion. He told others $5 billion. I got my hands on a copy of his personal net worth statement that spring, which revealed a much smaller figure. 2 months later, a report commissioned by his bankers and introduced in regulatory hearings put Trump in the red by almost $300 million. This was 3 decades before the New York Times report on his tax returns. In another revealing anecdote, Trump made a call to a Forbes reporter under his favorite fictitious name, John Barron. Barron tried to convince the journalist he should rank higher on the prestigious Forbes 400 list. And David K. Johnston tells this story. After the destruction of the Bonwit Teller building to build Trump Tower, a chorus of New Yorkers criticized Trump's decision to destroy the facade art along with it. A front-page New York Times story reported unsuccessful attempts to reach Trump. Instead, the paper got a call from John Barron, a vice president of the Trump Organization. He said that taking down the sculptures would have cost $32,000, delayed the construction of Trump Tower by 3 weeks, and run the risk of killing people if the stones crash to the ground. Johnston describes this 1991 response when Trump used a second pseudonym.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?